Hello and welcome to the IB Economist. And this video will be the basics of demand. First of all, what is demand in economics? The IB definition is, demand is the various quantities of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at various prices throughout a period of time. But then there's also quantity demanded, which is different. So the quantity demanded is the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at one specific price during a period of time. While demand is there's two variances in there. It's the various quantities and various prices. So the demand schedule is a tabular representation of demand, basically. It shows the prices and the various quantities demanded at each price. So now let's draw a demand diagram. Remember to label your x-axis quantity and your y-axis price. And a demand curve is a downward sloping line going from left to right. But even if it's drawn as a straight line, it's still referred to as a curve. It shows a negative correlation between the price and the quantity demanded, which is pretty obvious because if something is more expensive, you would want to buy less of it or not buy it at all. And make sure to label your diagram and have a title that says market for good X or demand for good X. And usually you want to draw that letter D there to indicate that it's a demand curve. So if we add some numbers onto this demand curve here, you can see that it's just a graphical representation of the demand schedule. So now let's talk about the law of demand, which states that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity demand decreases. Ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus means all else equal, so only the price of the good changes and nothing else does. This is also true vice versa, which means that if the price decreases, then the quantity demanded also increases. And there's an inverse relationship, and this is why the demand curve is downward sloping. So how does the law of demand actually work? There's two effects. There's the income effect and the substitution effect. So if the price of a good falls, then people who are buying it before the price decrease now effectively experience an increase in income because they can buy the same amount but with less money. For example, if you could buy 3 orange balls with a certain amount of money, but then the price decreased, so you can buy 5 orange balls with the same amount of money, then you would buy more of them. And now let's look at the substitution effect, which says that if the price of one good falls, then other similar substitute products are now relatively more expensive. So consumers who are buying the other substitutes are now likely to buy the cheaper good instead. For example, if the price of this purple ball now fell to $2, then people are more likely to buy it instead of the substitute, which price didn't change. So the quantity demanded of this purple ball will now increase. And these are both movements along the demand curve. So let's talk more about movements along a demand curve. For example, if you have the market for pens, don't forget their labels, price and quantity. And then you have point A and point B. Point A is when the price is $1 and the quantity demanded is 100 pens. And point B would be the other one on the graph there. So if price increases from $1 to $2, then there will be a movement along the curve from A to B, and quantity demanded decreases. Okay, now let's talk about shifts in the demand curve. So we have this demand curve over here, and if you were to represent a movement, then as we just seen, you would have 2 points on the curve, and then price would change, and that's what causes a movement along the demand curve. Only price changes. But then, if it's still the same demand relationship, it's the same line. But if you have a shift, then you have a completely different demand curve. Don't forget to label D1, D2, or D0, D1, and also draw arrows. So for example, this is a graph of demand increasing, so it shifts to the right. And these are caused by non-price determinants, and the quantity demanded changes at all prices. So what are these non-price determinants that affect demand? There's income, population and demographics, taste and preferences, which includes advertising, and there's the prices of complementary and substitute goods. Now let's talk about income. So there's two types of goods. There's normal and inferior goods. Most goods are normal. And normal means as incomes increase, demand for the good also increases, which makes sense because if you have more money, then you're more likely to buy more stuff. Now let's talk about inferior goods, which are things like ramen noodles or craft thinner, like bad quality and cheap items that you have to buy because you can't afford anything better. And there's also public transit if you can't afford a car, or generic brand, plain, no-name clothing because you can't afford anything better. So these, as incomes increase, demand actually decreases because you can afford to buy better things, so you don't buy this cheap quality inferior good. Now let's talk about consumer substitutes. If the price of a substitute good increases, then demand for the original good also increases. There is a positive relationship. Let's do an example. If you had the purple ball and the orange ball, and then the price of the purple ball increased to $3, then people who would have bought the purple ball now would buy the orange ball. So the demand for the orange ball actually increases. This could be represented as a movement along the curve for the market for the purple ball, but a shift in the demand curve in the market for the orange ball. So in the explanation, you would say, due to an increase in the price of a substitute, the demand for orange balls increased, and the demand curve shifts right from D1 to D2. Make sure to reference the labels on your diagram in your explanation, or you might lose marks. The next factor is complementary goods, and these are goods that are usually used together, like coffee and coffee makers, or pillows and pillowcases, CDs and CD players, computers and keyboards, all that kind of stuff. So if the price of a complement increases, then demand for the original good will decrease, and there is a negative relationship, which also makes sense because you would have to buy the complementary good to use the first good, or vice versa, and then if it's more expensive, then you don't want to buy it. Here are some other factors of demand. There's tastes and preferences, which is largely influenced by advertising. There can also be negative advertising too, especially for things like tobacco and alcohol. There's population. A larger population means more customers who could buy the product, so demand would increase. And demographics, like the proportion of senior citizens or proportion of children, could also increase the demand for certain items. And finally, there's seasonal factor. For example, in December, the demand for Christmas decorations increases. So that's the end of this crash course on the basics of demand. Best of luck surviving the IB, guys, and make sure to like and subscribe.